Ancient Egyptians built their civilization with a sacred, everyday drink. This was not the beer you know today, but a thick, nutritious brew so vital it was used to pay the workers who constructed the pyramids. By the end of this, you will know the complete step-by-step process for how they turned simple bread into a fermented beverage that fueled an empire. We will uncover the surprising ingredients they used and reveal how they mastered fermentation thousands of years ago. What kind of flavor do you think a beer made from bread could possibly have? This thick, nutritious brew was the very lifeblood of the civilization. Think of it not as a luxury, but as the ancient equivalent of a daily meal, a paycheck, and a spiritual offering all rolled into one. For the laborers constructing the Great Pyramids, their wages were often paid in beer. A worker might receive 3 or 4 loaves of bread and several jugs of this sustaining beverage each day. It was a practical currency, a direct fuel for the immense physical effort required to move million-ton blocks of stone, but its importance stretched far beyond the construction sites. Beer was a cornerstone of the Egyptian diet. It was safer to drink than the water from the Nile, which could carry dangerous microbes. The fermentation process killed off many harmful bacteria, making it a vital source of hydration. And because it was made from partially baked barley bread, it was packed with calories, vitamins, and minerals. This was not a drink for getting drunk, but for getting through the day. Its role extended into the divine realm as well. The god Osiris was credited with teaching humanity the art of brewing. Because of this, beer was a fundamental offering left in tombs. It was a gift for the gods, yes, but also crucial provisions for the deceased in the afterlife. To be buried without a supply of beer was to risk hunger and thirst for all eternity. So when we talk about ancient Egyptian beer, we are not discussing a simple pleasure. We are talking about a substance that powered an empire, paid its people, and connected them to their gods. This deep connection between the earthly and the divine begins with a myth. Osiris, the great god of the afterlife and rebirth, was believed to have gifted humanity with the knowledge of agriculture and brewing. This was not a casual invention, but a sacred act of creation meant to sustain civilization itself. Because of this divine origin, brewing was never just a chore or a trade. It was a ritual, a reenactment of a god's generosity. Every step, from grinding the grain to mixing the mash, was accompanied by prayers and invocations. The brewers were not merely cooks, they were priests of a sort, performing a sacred duty. Temple complexes often housed their own large-scale breweries, operated by priestesses and dedicated workers. Here, beer was produced in vast quantities not for public sale, but for the gods. It was a primary offering, poured out in libations at altars or left in vessels within the inner sanctums of temples. The Egyptians believed the deities would consume the essence of the beer, its spiritual energy, leaving the physical liquid behind. This act of offering was crucial. It was a way to nourish the gods, to maintain their favor, and to ensure the continued order of the universe, a concept known as Mot. A satisfied god meant a bountiful Nile flood, a successful harvest, and protection from chaos. So the next time you see a depiction of an Egyptian raising a jar, they might not just be enjoying a drink. They could be participating in a ritual that connected their world directly to the divine, a tradition that started with a gift from a god and fueled the very heartbeat of an empire. So what was actually inside those clay jars? The primary grain was not the barley we associate with modern beer. It was emmer wheat, a hardy, ancient grain with a tough husk that thrived in the Nile's sun-baked soil. Sometimes barley was used alongside it, but emmer was the true backbone of the brew. This choice of grain gave the beer its characteristic cloudy appearance and a thick, porridge-like consistency. And here is the biggest surprise for any modern beer lover. There were absolutely no hops. The bittering agent we take for granted today was completely unknown along the Nile. So how did they balance the sweetness and preserve their creation? They turned to the bounty of their land. Ripe, sweet dates were crushed into the mix, providing a rich, caramel-like sugar that the yeast would eagerly devour. Honey was sometimes added for extra potency and a floral sweetness, and for a complex, aromatic flavor that also helped ward off spoilage, they used a blend of herbs and spices. Think of the earthy, citrus note of coriander or the sharp, piney essence of juniper berries. These were not random additions. Each ingredient had a purpose, sourced from up and down the river. The emmer and barley came from the vast fields irrigated by the Nile's annual flood. Dates were harvested from the countless palm trees that dotted the landscape. Herbs like coriander were cultivated in garden plots or gathered from the wild. Every sip was a direct taste of Egypt itself, a liquid map of its agriculture and environment. This unique combination of grains, fruits, and spices created a flavor profile we can only try to reconstruct today. It was likely sweet, tangy, and aromatic, a world away from the crisp, bitter beers that fill our glasses. The secret to their beer did not start in a barrel, but in an oven. They began by baking a unique kind of bread known as bappir. This was not the soft, fluffy loaf you would serve with a meal. Bappir was a dense, crumbly cake made from a coarse mix of barley and emmer wheat, sometimes sweetened with dates. Its name even translates roughly to beer bread, defining its singular purpose. Why go through the trouble of baking bread only to crumble it into a vat of water? The answer lies in a brilliant, two-step mastery of fermentation. First, by making bread, they were cultivating and trapping wild yeast. The bakers would mix the dough and leave it exposed to the air, allowing the natural yeasts floating in the environment to settle and multiply. This created a powerful, living starter that was packed into every loaf. The baking process itself was a careful balancing act. The bappir was only partially baked, just enough to set the structure of the bread, but not enough to kill all the precious yeast inside. Think of it as being dried in a low oven rather than fully cooked. A fully baked loaf would have meant a dead yeast culture, and without living yeast, there can be no fermentation, no bubbles, no alcohol. This lightly baked, yeast-rich bread was the true engine of the entire operation. Once cooled, the hard loaves of bappir were broken up into large ceramic jars. Water was poured over the top, and the mixture was left to sit. The still active yeast, now rehydrated and hungry, would wake up and begin feasting on the sugars from the grain and the dates. This is where the magic happened, transforming a jar of wet breadcrumbs into a bubbling, fermenting brew. So this was not a matter of using leftover bread. This was a deliberate, ingenious process. They were using bread as a portable, stable vehicle for the most important ingredient of all, the living microorganism that would do the hard work of creating their sacred beverage. Those dense, yeast-rich loaves of bappir held the potential for beer, but they needed to be broken. The next step was a process of deliberate, controlled destruction. Workers would take the hard, partially baked cakes and begin crumbling them by hand into enormous, open-topped vats. These vessels were not made of wood or metal, but of thick, porous clay, sometimes carved directly from stone. Their size was immense, often standing as tall as a person, designed to hold enough mash to feed and hydrate an entire work crew, or supply a temple for its daily offerings. The crumbling was a physical task, but it was not about creating a fine, uniform powder. In fact, they wanted larger, chunkier pieces. A coarse crumb created a loose, porous bed within the vat. When water was added, this structure allowed the liquid to flow freely around every piece of bread, ensuring that every last bit of starchy goodness was exposed and could be converted into the sugars the yeast craved. Think of it like making a giant pot of tea. If you ground the tea leaves into dust, you would get a muddy, bitter mess that is difficult to strain. But if you use whole leaves or large pieces, the water can circulate, extracting the perfect amount of flavor. The ancient Egyptian brewers understood this principle perfectly. They were building a filter bed from the very ingredients of their brew, setting the stage for the sweet, fermentable liquid that would soon become their beer. With the crumbled bread settled in the vat, the next step was to awaken its hidden sweetness. They poured hot water over the coarse mixture, creating a thick, steamy mash. This was not a simple soaking. This crucial step, which we call mashing, was a quiet miracle of biochemistry happening right there in the clay jar. The heat of the water activated natural enzymes present within the grains themselves. Think of these enzymes as microscopic keys, and the complex starches in the bread as intricate locks. When the hot water unlocked them, these enzymes began furiously breaking the long, tangled starch chains down into simple, delicious sugars. This sweet liquid, known as wort, is the very foundation of any beer, the food that the yeast will later feast upon. How did they manage this temperature-sensitive process without any thermometers? They were masters of observation, using experience passed down through generations. They likely heated water in large pots over fires until it was hot to the touch, but not boiling, perhaps steamy with wisps of vapor. Boiling water would have been too hot, as it can destroy those precious enzymes. They would then pour this carefully heated water into the vat, creating a warm, porridge-like environment perfect for the sugar conversion to occur. The mash would then be left to sit, perhaps for an hour or more, while the unseen work continued. During this time, the brewer's skill was in maintaining that ideal warmth, maybe by wrapping the vat in cloth or placing it in a sunny, sheltered spot. All the while, inside that murky mixture, starches were dissolving, transforming the vat into a treasure trove of fermentable sugar, setting the stage for the true magic to begin. But that sweet liquid was still trapped within a thick slurry of soggy bread. The challenge now was to free it, to separate the precious wort from its solid remains. This was a messy, hands-on process of filtration, a task that fell to the brewers using surprisingly effective ancient tools. They would carefully pour the entire contents of the mash vat into large, shallow basins. Laid across these basins were finely woven reed mats or conical sieves made from rushes and reeds. Think of these not as fine strainers, but as a natural, porous filter. As the thick liquid was poured in, the woven reeds would catch the larger chunks of grain and bread, allowing the golden, sugary wort to trickle through into a clean collecting jar below. It was not a quick process. They would likely press down on the solids with their hands or a flat tool, squeezing out every last drop of the valuable liquid. The result was not the crystal-clear beverage we expect today. It would have been hazy, perhaps with a slight cloudiness from fine particles, but it was a world away from the porridge-like mash they started with. This step was absolutely crucial. Leaving too much solid matter in the liquid would have led to off flavors and a less stable final product. Every drop of this liquid gold was worth the effort, a sweet, aromatic foundation now perfectly prepared for its final, and most magical, transformation. This sweet, filtered wort was a blank canvas, ready for its final artistic touches. The brewers would now introduce ingredients that defined the beer's character, starting with a generous helping of mashed dates. They did not just drop whole fruits into the jar. Instead, they would take ripe dates, remove the pits, and crush them into a thick, sticky paste. This paste was then stirred directly into the golden liquid. The dates served a dual purpose. Their intense, caramel-like sweetness provided a feast for the waiting yeast, promising a more vigorous fermentation and a potentially stronger brew. But they also imparted a rich, fruity depth that balanced the earthy flavor of the emmer wheat. This was their primary sweetener, a natural and abundant source of sugar that made each sip a comforting, nourishing experience. Yet sweetness alone was not the goal. To create a truly complex beverage, they reached for their herb gardens and the wild plants growing along the Nile. A handful of crushed coriander seeds could be added, introducing a subtle, citrusy note. Saffron might be used in more expensive temple brews, lending a golden hue and a delicate, almost honey-like aroma. In some regions, they might have used mint for a refreshing, cool finish, or juniper berries for a sharp, piney bite that cut through the sweetness. These botanical additions were not random. They were the original recipe builders, the elements that distinguished a beer from Thebes from one brewed in Memphis. A brewer living near the coast might incorporate herbs we can only guess at today, using local plants to create a signature flavor. And beyond the taste, many of these herbs and spices had a practical, hidden benefit. Their natural oils possessed mild preservative qualities, helping to keep the beer from spoiling too quickly in the hot Egyptian climate. So with a final stir, the brew was complete. A simple mixture of grain and water had been transformed into a sweet, spiced, and aromatic elixir, uniquely Egyptian in every way. Now the real magic could begin. With the sweet, spiced wort prepared and resting in its wide-mouthed clay jar, the most critical and mysterious phase of the brewing process unfolded entirely on its own. Unlike modern brewers who carefully pitch a specific strain of lab-cultivated yeast, The ancient Egyptians relied on a force they could not see, the wild yeast floating in the very air around them. They were not adding an ingredient, they were inviting an invisible guest. That partially baked bappir bread, crumbled into the mix from the very start, was the key. It was already teeming with live, dormant yeast cultures that had been captured during the bread-making process. As the warm, sugary wort sat in its open vat, these yeasts reawakened with a vengeance. At the same time, the open top of the jar acted like a net, catching other wild yeast cells drifting on the desert breeze or present in the brewery itself. This created a complex, natural fermentation driven by a local ecosystem of microorganisms. The brewers had no concept of these microscopic creatures, of course. To them, this transformation was a form of divine magic, a living proof of Osiris's gift. They saw the results, not the cause. Bubbles would slowly begin to rise to the surface, a gentle fizzing that signaled the yeast was alive and feasting on the sugars. A frothy, fragrant foam would develop atop the liquid, and a distinct, tangy aroma would fill the air. How long did they wait for this alchemy to complete? Without clocks or precise measurements, they relied on their senses. It might have taken 2 days, perhaps 3 or 4, depending on the temperature. They knew the beer was ready not by a calendar, but when the vigorous bubbling subsided and the foam began to settle, leaving behind a slightly sour, pleasantly effervescent liquid. This was the moment of truth, when a simple mixture of grain, fruit, and herbs finally became the sacred, sustaining brew that built a civilization. These fermentation jars were more than simple containers, they were living environments. The most common vessel was a large ceramic jar known as a zithos, with a wide, open mouth that made it easy to pour in the mash and stir the contents. Its rounded base was designed not to stand flat on the ground, but to be nestled into the sand or propped within a ring stand, a design that helped control temperature and made it easier to tip for decanting the finished beer. While the open top was essential for catching wild yeast, it also presented a problem. How do you protect a precious, fermenting liquid from dust, insects, and other contaminants for days on end? The solution was both simple and brilliant. Brewers would drape a clean linen cloth over the opening, securing it with a cord around the jar's rim. This cloth acted as a breathable barrier. It kept out unwanted debris while still allowing the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast to bubble up and escape harmlessly into the air. Without this release, pressure would have built up until the vessel cracked. For longer storage or transport, they might seal the jar more completely with a disc of pottery or a lump of wet clay, perhaps leaving a tiny vent hole. Archaeologists have found countless examples of these vessels, some still stained with the residue of their last batch, buried in the corners of homes and temple breweries. The very design of these pots tells a silent story of ancient problem-solving, a perfect marriage of form and function that cradled the magical process of fermentation, protecting it until the moment it was ready to drink. You could smell the magic before you ever saw it. A thick, yeasty aroma, like baking bread and ripening fruit, would have filled the brewery. This was the unmistakable sign that the invisible workers, the wild yeasts, were busy at their feast. Inside those clay zithos jars, the liquid would have been a hive of quiet activity. A steady stream of tiny bubbles would rise from the depths, churning the surface into a frothy, creamy foam. The air itself would pop and fizz with the sound of escaping carbon dioxide, a gentle, percussive rhythm that signaled a healthy, active brew. This sensory symphony was the only dashboard the ancient brewers had. There were no hydrometers to measure sugar levels, no thermometers to check the heat. The women who typically managed this process, a skilled and vital role in Egyptian society, used their own senses as the ultimate tools. They would lean over the open jars, their faces close to the fragrant steam. They listened to the bubbling, learning its language. A vigorous, rapid fizz meant the fermentation was in its most energetic phase. As the days passed, that bubbling would slow, becoming lazy and intermittent. The thick head of foam would start to collapse back into the liquid. This was the first clue that the yeast was running out of food, that the great sugar feast was coming to an end. But sight and sound were not enough. The final test was always taste. Using a clean dipper, a brewer would draw a small sample of the liquid. She would judge its sweetness and its sourness, its body and its bite. The goal was not a dry, crisp modern beer. It was a brew that balanced the residual sweetness of the dates with a pleasant, tangy sharpness from the fermentation. When the bubbles had nearly stopped and the flavor was just right, slightly effervescent and wonderfully complex, she knew the beer was ready. It was a knowledge born of experience, passed from mother to daughter, a sacred guardianship of the bubbling jars that turned simple ingredients into the lifeblood of Egypt. That final sip from the clay jar would have been a world away from any beer you know. Forget a clear, golden lager. This beverage was a thick, cloudy porridge, a nourishing meal in a cup. Its alcohol content was likely quite low, perhaps only 3 or 4%, making it a mild, daily drink rather than an intoxicant. The first flavor to hit your tongue would have been a distinct sweetness, a rich, caramel note from the generous mash of dates stirred into the brew. But that sweetness was quickly balanced by a lively, tangy sharpness, a direct result of the wild yeast fermentation. This sourdough-like zing would have given the beer a refreshing quality, cutting through the richness. And floating over it all was a complex herbal aroma, the earthy whisper of coriander or the sharp, clean note of juniper, a fragrant bouquet from the banks of the Nile. You would not simply drink this beer, you would experience it with your entire senses. And because of its thick, almost slurry-like consistency, you would not drink it directly from the jar. At the bottom of every vessel lay a sediment of spent grain and date pulp. To avoid this gritty residue, the Egyptians used a clever tool, the straw. These were not bendy plastic tubes, but long reeds, sometimes tipped with a perforated metal strainer to act as a final filter. A group of workers or a family would often gather around a single large jar, each person dipping their own personal straw into the communal brew. This was not just a practical solution, it was a social ritual. Every sip was a direct connection to the land, a taste of sacred grain, wild yeast, and desert herbs, all coming together in a uniquely Egyptian creation that was as much about sustenance as it was about community. This thick, nourishing beer was on the table of every single Egyptian, a true drink for the people. From the pharaoh in his palace to the farmer in his field, no one was excluded from this daily ritual. Even children consumed a watered-down version of the brew. The reason was simple and starkly practical. The water from the Nile River, the very source of life for Egypt, was also a source of danger. It swirled with invisible threats, bacteria and parasites that caused debilitating illnesses like dysentery and cholera. The fermentation process, however, created a powerful line of defense. As the wild yeasts thrived and multiplied, they produced alcohol and an acidic environment that killed off most of those harmful microbes. So while the water could make you sick, the beer was a safe, hydrating, and life-giving alternative. It was the original public health measure, a daily dose of protection served in a clay cup. This was not a luxury, but a necessity woven into the fabric of existence. A typical laborer, like one of the men hauling stones for the Great Pyramid, received a daily ration that was both his wage and his lunch. Records show these workers were often given 3 or 4 loaves of bread and around 4 liters of beer each day. Think of that, 4 liters. This was not about getting drunk, it was about survival. That volume of beer provided a massive number of calories from the emmer wheat and dates, along with essential B vitamins from the fermented grains, which helped their bodies convert food into energy. It was the fuel that powered the construction of the world's most iconic monuments, so every sip served a triple purpose, quenching thirst, fighting disease, and building an empire, one nourishing gulp at a time. The true power of this beverage is etched not just in temple walls, but on ancient payroll records. At the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who carved the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, we find some of history's most detailed pay stubs. These workers were not paid in gold or silver, but in the essentials of life. Their monthly compensation was a precise measure of grain for baking bread and a set number of jars of beer. One surviving record, for example, details a worker receiving 3 1/3 jugs of beer each day. This was not a bonus or an occasional treat, it was the standard wage, a direct reflection of the labor they provided. Why use beer as money? The answer is brilliantly practical. Coins would have been useless in a remote desert village. You cannot eat a piece of metal. But grain and beer were universally valued. They were storable, divisible, and most importantly, consumable. A worker could immediately use his ration to feed himself and his family, or he could trade a jar of beer with a neighbor for fish, vegetables, or pottery. This system created a stable, localized economy that ran on calories and hydration. It eliminated the need for a complex monetary system and ensured that the workforce was always nourished, hydrated, and motivated. The beer ration was the engine of this entire operation. Without that daily fuel, the skilled hands that painted hieroglyphs and chiseled burial chambers would have lacked the strength and focus for their meticulous work. So the next time you think of currency, picture a clay jar filled with a cloudy, fermented brew. It was the direct deposit that built eternity, one satisfying sip at a time. Behind the scenes of every great civilization are its unsung artisans, and in ancient Egypt, that title often belonged to the women. The sacred art of brewing was not a grand, state-controlled industry, but a vital domestic craft, and its masters were the women of the household. These female brewers were known as the Hemmet, a title that commanded respect. A Hemmet was not merely a cook. She was a skilled craftswoman, a keeper of a complex biological process that sustained her family and community. This knowledge was her domain, a form of power and economic contribution passed from mother to daughter over generations. Every young girl would have learned the rhythms of the brewery, how to judge the heat of the water for the mash by the steam rising from the pot, how to listen for the slow, lazy bubbling that signaled the fermentation was complete. It was as essential a household skill as baking bread or weaving cloth, because in a very real sense, it was an extension of both. A family's health depended on her ability to produce a safe, nutritious beverage day after day. But the influence of the Hemmet extended far beyond the home. Some women used this expertise to build commercial enterprises. They would produce beer in larger quantities, selling it from their homes or in marketplaces, becoming important, independent economic players in their villages and towns. Imagine a woman in Thebes or Memphis, known throughout her neighborhood for producing a particularly fine brew with a hint of local mint. Her skill brought her not just income, but a recognized place and status in the social fabric. She was the living link between the divine gift of Osiris and the daily life of the street, a testament to the quiet, powerful role women played in turning grain and water into the lifeblood of an empire. While the home brewer perfected her craft for a single family, the state was building breweries of staggering size. The archaeological site at Hierakonpolis reveals a facility that operated on an almost industrial scale. Here, archaeologists uncovered a complex of large, sunken vats, each capable of holding hundreds of liters of mash. These were not the simple clay jars of a household, but permanent installations built directly into the ground, lined with ceramic tiles to create a massive, temperature-controlled environment for fermentation. This was beer production on a level designed to feed thousands, not just a single village. The workforce required to run such an operation was immense. It was a coordinated effort of laborers, bakers, and overseers, all working in a carefully choreographed routine. Dozens of workers would have been tasked with grinding the grain, mixing and partially baking the enormous quantities of bappir bread, and hauling water from the Nile to fill the vast fermentation vats. This was not a casual domestic task, it was a state-sponsored industry, a logistical marvel of the ancient world. The sheer volume of beer produced in these facilities is difficult to overstate. A single royal festival or religious ceremony could require thousands of jugs. The gods themselves were believed to have a mighty thirst, and vast quantities were poured out as libations at temple altars each day. The royal court, the army, and the thousands of laborers on state projects like pyramid construction all depended on this systematic, large-scale production. This centralized brewing was the ultimate expression of the beverage's importance, transforming a sacred household ritual into the fuel that powered the very engine of the state. So how do we know the intricate details of a process that vanished thousands of years ago? The proof is not in a single scroll, but in a collection of quiet clues left behind in the dust. Archaeologists have unearthed the physical remains of ancient breweries, like the one at Hierakonpolis. where rows of sunken vats still stand in silent testimony to the scale of production. But the evidence goes far beyond empty jars. Inside tombs, we find vivid paintings on the walls that serve as a step-by-step instruction manual for the afterlife. These scenes show every stage, from men crushing grain with heavy stones to women straining the thick mash through sieves into waiting pots. They are frozen moments of daily life, intended to magically provide the deceased with an eternal supply of beer. Even more personal are the detailed wooden models placed in tombs. These are miniature, three-dimensional dioramas of a bustling brewery, complete with tiny figures grinding grain, mixing mash, and tending to the fermentation jars. They are a snapshot of an entire industry, carved in wood to serve the dead for eternity. Perhaps the most compelling evidence, however, comes from science itself. Using advanced techniques, researchers can now analyze the crusty residue found inside ancient pottery. They have detected the chemical fingerprints of barley, emmer wheat, and dates, along with telltale signs of fermentation like oxalate beerstone. This scientific analysis confirms what the paintings and models show us, proving that the recipes we have discussed were not just artistic fantasy, but were actually brewed and consumed. Each of these pieces, the art, the models, and the chemistry, locks together to form an undeniable picture. They show us that this sacred, sustaining beverage was so deeply woven into Egyptian life that they could not imagine an existence in the next world without it. These vibrant tomb paintings are far more than ancient art. They are functional blueprints for immortality. On the walls of the tomb of a nobleman named Tai at Saqqara, the entire brewing process unfolds in a continuous, detailed narrative. We see workers using heavy stones to crush grain into coarse flour. In the next scene, that flour is mixed with water and shaped into the dense loaves of bappir bread. The paintings even show the crucial, partial baking of those loaves over an open fire, a step that preserved the live yeast. Then comes the crumbling of the bread into a large vat, followed by the careful addition of water to create the mash. One of the most telling scenes depicts a worker straining this thick mixture through a sieve into a waiting pot. Capturing the precise moment the sweet wort is separated from the solid grain. Every action, from the bending of a back to the pouring of a liquid, is captured with a clarity that feels almost instructional. Why would a wealthy official like Tai want this entire process painted on the walls of his eternal home? The Egyptians believed in a literal afterlife, a continuation of existence that required the same sustenance as the living world. These scenes were not mere decoration, they were magical insurance. By depicting the process in such exact detail, the Egyptians believed they could conjure an endless supply of beer for the soul of the deceased, ensuring they would never know hunger or thirst in the next life. The paintings were a permanent, activated recipe, a divine command to the universe to provide, but the instructions did not stop with two-dimensional images. For those who could afford it, the magic was made even more potent with three-dimensional models. Placed directly in the burial chamber, these wooden dioramas show a bustling, miniature brewery in action. Tiny carved figures, no taller than your hand, are forever frozen in their tasks. One figure kneels, grinding grain between two stones. Another stands over a vat, using both hands to press a sieve, straining the mash. A third carefully tends to the tall fermentation jars. The level of detail is astonishing, from the expression of concentration on a carved face to the individual strands of a reed sieve. These models were more than toys. They were functional ritual objects. Their purpose was to animate the entire brewing process for eternity, to ensure that every step, from start to finish, would magically continue to operate on behalf of the tomb's owner. Together, the paintings and the models form a perfect visual record. They confirm the steps we have described, but they also reveal something deeper, a profound anxiety about the afterlife. The Egyptians left nothing to chance. They ensured that the knowledge of how to brew, the very craft that sustained life on Earth, would follow them into the hereafter, a sacred skill too vital to be left behind. Those silent jars have finally begun to speak through modern science. Researchers now use powerful tools like gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to listen in. Think of these techniques as superhuman senses, capable of detecting the faintest chemical whispers left behind by ingredients that vanished millennia ago. A scientist might take a tiny scraping of crusty residue from the inside of a beer jug found in a tomb. They vaporize this ancient crust and run it through the gas chromatograph, which acts like a molecular racetrack, separating thousands of different chemical compounds from one another. Then, the mass spectrometer takes over, weighing each individual molecule and revealing its unique identity. Together, they form a complete chemical fingerprint of what was once inside that jar. This is not guesswork, it is direct evidence. One of the most telling discoveries has been the presence of a compound called calcium oxalate, more commonly known as beer stone. This is a crystalline scum that forms during fermentation, a stubborn residue familiar to any modern brewer who has ever cleaned a fermentation tank. Finding beer stone inside an Egyptian pot is a scientific smoking gun. It is a definitive chemical signature that barley was fermented there. This single compound confirms that the scenes painted on tomb walls were not just symbolic art. They were records of a real, biochemical process. But the science goes even further, confirming the presence of dates through traces of their unique sugars and identifying the specific lipids from emmer wheat. These advanced analyses have transformed our understanding from an educated reconstruction into a verified recipe, proving that the ancient Egyptians were master biochemists long before the science even had a name. This chemical evidence provided the ultimate recipe for a modern experiment. Could we actually brew this ancient beer today? Archaeologists teamed up with a daring craft brewer, Dogfish Head, to attempt the impossible. Their mission was to resurrect a 4,000-year-old beverage using only the tools and ingredients available to the ancient Egyptians. The first major hurdle was the grain. Modern barley is bred for brewing, but the ancient emmer wheat is a different beast. Its tough husk and primitive genetics presented a real challenge for the malting process, the first step in releasing its fermentable sugars. The Dogfish Head team had to source authentic emmer and then figure out how to coax the sugars from it without modern equipment. They turned to the tomb paintings for guidance, replicating the method of making the dense, partially baked bappir bread. They baked the loaves in a wood-fired oven, careful not to kill the wild yeast, then crumbled the hard cakes into a replica clay vat, just as the ancient artisans would have done. For the botanical flavors, they avoided all modern hops, instead using dried za'atar, a Middle Eastern herb blend containing thyme and savory, along with the traditional dates for that essential, caramel-like sweetness. The entire fermentation relied on capturing wild yeast from the air, a risky and unpredictable process that made every batch a unique roll of the dice. The final product was a revelation. The beer, which they named Midas Touch, was unlike anything on the modern market. It poured a hazy golden color with a thick, persistent head. The taste was a complex symphony of flavors, starting with the distinct sweetness of honey and dates, followed by a subtle, earthy sourness from the wild fermentation, and finishing with a fragrant, herbal aroma from the ancient spices. It was both refreshing and nourishing, a drink you could imagine savoring after a long day of work under the Egyptian sun. This modern recreation proved something vital, that the ancient methods were not just primitive guesses. They were a sophisticated, effective technology for creating a stable, nutritious, and uniquely flavorful beverage that truly was the lifeblood of a civilization. That thick, daily ration beer was the people's fuel, but the Egyptians also understood the art of the special occasion. Hieroglyphic inscriptions and administrative records carefully distinguish between different types of beer, suggesting a spectrum of quality and strength. The standard worker's brew, nourishing and mild, was one thing, but for a grand festival or a royal celebration, something far more potent was required. Think of a festival beer, a brew crafted with extra dates and honey for a higher sugar content, which the yeast would convert into more alcohol. This stronger beverage would have been reserved for honoring the gods during great ceremonies or feasting the pharaoh's court, a deliberate step up from the everyday drink. Beyond mere strength, there is compelling evidence for specialized medicinal brews. The Ebers Papyrus, a vast medical text, prescribes beer as a base for various remedies. They would infuse the wort with specific herbs, roots, or tree saps known for their healing properties. A beer infused with thyme might be used to soothe a cough, while one with willow bark could have eased aches and pains. This was ancient pharmacology in a jar, leveraging beer's safe liquid base to deliver plant-based treatments. The terminology itself reveals their sophistication. Texts mention classifications like iron beer, likely a strong, dark brew, and friends beer, perhaps a lighter, more social drink. Scribes even recorded the beer of the protector, possibly a ration for temple guards that required extra fortitude. So the next time you look at a modern menu of pale ales and stouts, remember the ancient Egyptian brewer. She too was a master of her craft, skillfully adjusting her recipes to create everything from a hydrating daily staple to a celebratory elixir, proving that even 4,000 years ago, there was a perfect beer for every purpose. The clinking of clay jars was the sound of friendship in ancient Egypt. After a long day building monuments or tending to fields, the true reward was not just the beer itself, but the act of sharing it. This was not a solitary pleasure. It was a communal ritual that stitched the social fabric together. Picture a typical Egyptian home at dusk. The family gathers around a single, large zithos jar set in the center of the room. Each person, from the eldest grandfather to the youngest adult, holds their own personal straw, a long reed tipped with a strainer. They dip their straws into the same communal brew, sharing not just the liquid, but the moment. There is laughter, conversation, and the quiet satisfaction of a day's work completed. This simple act was a powerful affirmation of family bonds, a daily reminder that they provided for one another. But the community extended beyond the home. In every village, the tavern served as the vital social hub. These were not elaborate bars, but often just a shaded corner of a house or a simple courtyard. Here, workers from different trades would converge, their straws in hand, ready to unwind. The air would be thick with the yeasty aroma of beer and the buzz of conversation. A fisherman might share tales of his catch from the Nile, while a carpenter complained about a stubborn piece of acacia wood. In these taverns, social hierarchies softened. For a few hours, the laborer and the artisan were equals, connected by the shared vessel between them. This was where news was exchanged, friendships were forged, and the stresses of daily life were washed away by the tangy, nourishing brew. Even the grandest state festivals, dedicated to gods like Hathor or Bastet, were built around this same principle of communal consumption. Vast quantities of a stronger, festival beer were distributed to the public. Imagine thousands of people gathered in a temple courtyard, all partaking in the same sacred beverage. It was a collective experience that united the entire population, from the highest official to the most humble farmer, in a shared moment of celebration and reverence. The beer was the thread that connected them all, transforming a basic need for nourishment into the very glue that held society together. This sacred craft did not remain a secret of the Nile for long. The bustling trade routes that carried gold, incense, and ivory out of Egypt also carried the knowledge of brewing. As Egyptian merchants sailed across the Mediterranean and their armies marched into neighboring lands, they brought their taste for fermented grain with them. In the kingdom of Nubia, to the south, archaeologists have found evidence of large-scale brewing operations that mirror the Egyptian methods almost exactly. The Nubians adopted the technique of using crumbled, partially baked bread to start fermentation, creating their own powerful brews that became central to their rituals and daily life. This was not a one-way street, however. The Nubians likely added their own local twists, using different grains or wild herbs, creating a dialogue of flavor and technique that flowed up and down the river. To the east, in the ancient Levant, the story continued. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia mention a variety of beers, and while they had their own distinct traditions, the constant contact with Egypt through trade meant ideas and methods were constantly exchanged. A Canaanite merchant visiting an Egyptian port would have seen the rows of fermentation jars, smelled the distinctive yeasty aroma, and carried that sensory memory back to his own city, perhaps inspiring local brewers to experiment with new techniques. The Phoenicians, the master seafarers of the ancient world, became crucial vectors for this knowledge. As they established trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean, from Carthage to the coast of Spain, they brought not just goods, but technologies. The art of brewing, refined for millennia in Egypt, was now a portable commodity. carried in the minds and practices of travelers, slowly seeding the entire region with the potential for fermentation. This diffusion set the stage for the next great brewing civilizations. The Greeks, with their god Dionysus, initially favored wine, but they were certainly aware of beer, which they called zithos, a direct loan from the Egyptian name for their beer jars. While it was often looked down upon as a foreign, barbarian drink, the foundational principle of fermenting grain was now established in the European world. It was the Romans, pragmatic and efficient, who would truly industrialize the process they inherited. They adopted the Egyptian model of large-scale state-run breweries to supply their vast, sprawling legions. A Roman soldier stationed in cold, northern Britain could not rely on vineyards, but he could be supplied with grain to brew a sustaining, calorie-rich beer. The Roman cerevisia, the direct ancestor of the Spanish word for beer, cerveza, kept the armies marching and the empire functioning. So the next time you enjoy a modern beer, remember that its story is far older than the medieval monasteries of Europe. It is a story that began with the sacred vats of the Nile, a tradition of turning grain into magic that slowly, inexorably, conquered the ancient world one clay jar at a time. From sacred offering to pyramid builder's fuel, this ancient beer was a complex and ingeniously crafted masterpiece of everyday life. We have walked from the sun-drenched grain fields to the cool, dark fermentation jars, uncovering a process that was equal parts precise science and sacred art. It was a technology born of necessity, a delicious solution to the problems of hydration, nutrition, and even payment, all wrapped up in a single, clay jar. The true genius lies in how they mastered invisible forces, harnessing wild yeast without ever knowing it existed, turning simple bread into a bubbling, transformative elixir. Their legacy is not just in the grand monuments we still marvel at, but in the very idea of fermentation, a knowledge that would eventually travel the world. So we have to ask, what struck you the most on this journey? Was it the use of bread as the engine for fermentation, the communal straws dipped into a shared jar, or the fact that this cloudy brew was considered a form of currency? Share your most surprising discovery in the comments below, and if you enjoyed uncovering this ancient mystery, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets of the past.